What if I told you that in 1934, the United States accidentally destroyed an entire nation's economy with a single piece of legislation? And what if that same nation, 90 years later, is now using the exact same playbook in reverse against America? Today, December 27th, 2025, silver just smashed through $75 per ounce. We're looking at gains of over 150% this year alone. Gold is hovering above $4,500, and while everyone's talking about interest rates and inflation, almost nobody's connecting the dots to one of the most devastating economic attacks in modern history. This isn't coincidence. This is design. In 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Silver Purchase Act into law. On paper, it was supposed to help American silver miners during the Great Depression, but what it actually did was drain the silver reserves of China, the only major country in the world still on a silver standard, and sent their economy into a death spiral that contributed directly to the collapse of their government. We're talking about a 25% collapse in GDP, bank failures cascading across Shanghai, farmers watching their life savings evaporate overnight. And here's the kicker. This economic chaos directly contributed to the collapse of the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, and paved the way for the current regime that rules China today. Now, fast forward to 2025. China has become the world's largest consumer of silver. They've been stockpiling precious metals at unprecedented rates. BRICS nations led by China and Russia now control 50% of global gold production and have launched a precious metals exchange in Moscow designed to bypass the US dollar entirely. Do you see where this is going? What happened to China in 1934 might just be happening to America right now. Except this time, the script has been completely flipped. The pattern is undeniable, and by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why silver at $75 might just be the beginning of the greatest monetary reversal in modern history. The Silver Purchase Act of 1934 wasn't born in a vacuum. It emerged from the perfect storm of Depression-era desperation, powerful mining lobby interests, and a fundamental misunderstanding of global monetary interconnectedness that would have consequences lasting nearly a century. By 1933, America was still reeling from the stock market crash of 1929, 25% unemployment, bank failures destroying life savings overnight. President Roosevelt was desperate to try anything that might stabilize the economy and put Americans back to work. One of the most aggressive lobbying campaigns in Washington came from the Silver Bloc, a coalition of senators from mining states like Nevada, Colorado, and Montana. Senator Key Pittman of Nevada led this coalition with religious fervor. Nevada's economy depended almost entirely on silver mining, and the collapse in silver prices from $1.28 per ounce in 1920 to just 25 cents by 1932 had devastated the state. Pittman convinced Roosevelt that artificially inflating silver prices would create jobs, stimulate Western state economies, and somehow restore prosperity through monetary expansion. The thinking was seductively simple. If you make silver more valuable, you put more money in the pockets of silver miners and the communities that depended on them. States like Nevada, Colorado, and Montana would see immediate economic benefits. What nobody in Washington bothered to calculate was the global impact of tripling the world price of silver overnight on nations that still used silver as their monetary foundation. On June 19, 1934, FDR signed the Silver Purchase Act into law. The legislation directed the Treasury to buy massive amounts of silver until the metal made up 1/3 of America's monetary reserves. The statutory price was set at $1.29 per ounce, which effectively tripled the global price of silver almost immediately. American Treasury agents began buying silver aggressively in London, Shanghai, Mexico City, and every other market where the metal traded. Within months, the global silver price had risen from 35 cents per ounce to over 65 cents, with the U.S. government promising to continue purchasing until silver comprised exactly 25% of the nation's monetary base alongside gold. Here's where the story becomes devastating. America wasn't on a silver standard in 1934. They had moved to a gold exchange standard years earlier. The Silver Purchase Act was domestic economic policy designed to help American miners. But guess who was still using silver as the foundation of their entire monetary system? China. For over 400 years, China had operated on a silver-based currency system. The Chinese yuan was literally defined as a specific weight of silver. Chinese banks held their reserves in silver. Chinese trade was conducted in silver coins and ingots. It was one of the most stable monetary systems in the world, and during the early years of the Great Depression, China had actually avoided the worst economic devastation precisely because their currency was backed by silver instead of gold. Chinese silver reserves in 1934 totaled approximately 600 million ounces, accumulated over centuries of trade surpluses with European nations that paid for Chinese goods with Spanish and Mexican silver. This represented roughly 60% of their total monetary base and served as the foundation for their banking system, government finances, and international trade relationships. When America began buying silver at artificially inflated prices, something catastrophic happened to China's economy. Silver began flowing out of Chinese vaults and banks at unprecedented rates. Chinese silver merchants, faced with the choice between selling to their own government at traditional prices or selling to American agents at 3 times the market rate, chose the obvious option. Within 18 months, over 200 million ounces of silver had flowed from China to the United States Treasury. Chinese banks lost the reserves that backed their currency. The yuan collapsed against every other major currency. International trade ground to a halt because Chinese exporters couldn't price their goods in a currency that changed value daily. The Bank of China, the nation's central bank, faced liquidity crises that forced them to suspend convertibility between paper currency and silver. Regional banks failed across Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Beijing. Agricultural credit disappeared, forcing farmers to sell crops at depression prices or abandon their land entirely. By 1936, Chinese GDP had contracted by 25%. Industrial production fell by 40%. Unemployment in major cities exceeded 30%. The silver drain had created a deflationary spiral that destroyed businesses, wiped out savings, and made it impossible for the government to fund basic operations or military defense against Japanese expansion. This wasn't gradual economic adjustment. This was monetary warfare, whether intentional or not. American policy had weaponized silver and used it against the world's most populous nation, creating economic chaos that would have political consequences lasting generations. The Silver Purchase Act's impact on China went far beyond economic statistics. It directly contributed to the collapse of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang Party and created the conditions that allowed Mao Zedong's Communist Party to seize power 15 years later. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government had been fighting a brutal civil war against communist forces since 1927. By 1934, the nationalists had largely contained communist territories to rural areas in southern China and appeared to be winning the conflict through superior financing, international support, and control over major cities and industrial centers. But the nationalist government's strength depended entirely on their ability to maintain economic stability, collect taxes, and fund military operations against both communist insurgents and Japanese forces that had invaded Manchuria in 1931. The silver crisis destroyed all 3 capabilities simultaneously. Chinese government revenues collapsed as silver drainage made it impossible to maintain stable currency valuations. Tax collection became impossible in many regions, as the yuan's purchasing power fluctuated wildly from week to week. Military commanders couldn't budget for equipment, supplies, or soldier pay when currency values changed faster than they could update financial records. The nationalist government tried desperately to stop the silver outflow through capital controls, export restrictions, and currency regulations. In October 1934, they banned silver exports entirely and threatened criminal prosecution for anyone selling silver to foreign buyers. But these measures only accelerated the crisis by creating black markets and encouraging smuggling operations that drained silver reserves even faster. Chinese merchants and wealthy families, recognizing that the government couldn't maintain silver convertibility indefinitely, began converting their yuan holdings to foreign currencies or physical goods. This created additional pressure on silver reserves and forced the government to choose between defending their currency or funding essential services. By 1935, the nationalist government was forced to abandon the silver standard entirely and adopt a fiat currency system backed by government bonds rather than precious metals. This decision destroyed confidence in Chinese currency among international traders and made it nearly impossible to finance imports of military equipment needed to fight Japanese forces. The economic crisis created political instability that weakened nationalist control over rural areas where communist forces had been effectively contained. Farmers facing bankruptcy and unemployment became receptive to communist promises of land redistribution and debt forgiveness. Local officials struggling with collapsed tax revenues became vulnerable to corruption or outright collaboration with opposition forces. When the Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the nationalist government was already financially crippled by 3 years of silver-induced monetary crisis. They couldn't afford modern weapons, adequate supplies, or effective coordination between military units spread across enormous territories. The Japanese invasion succeeded partly because Chinese resistance was hampered by economic weakness directly traceable to American silver policy. Cities fell faster than they should have because Chinese forces lacked ammunition, fuel, and communication equipment that had become unaffordable after the currency crisis. Communist forces, operating with simpler financial needs and stronger ideological commitment, proved more resilient during the Japanese occupation and emerged from World War II in stronger relative position than the nationalists. The silver crisis had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Chinese internal conflicts. When civil war resumed after Japanese surrender in 1945, communist forces faced a nationalist government that had never fully recovered from the economic devastation of the 1930s. The victory of Mao's Communist Party in 1949 was the final consequence of American silver policy 15 years earlier. Whether American policymakers intended to destabilize China's government is irrelevant. The Silver Purchase Act demonstrated that monetary policy in one nation could destroy economic and political stability in another nation thousands of miles away. It was a lesson that Chinese leaders would never forget. The leaders who came to power in China after 1949 understood exactly what had happened to their nation during the 1930s. More importantly, they understood that control over monetary metals could be a matter of national survival in an interconnected global economy where financial weapons could be as devastating as military ones. Mao Zedong and the early communist leadership spent their first decades in power building economic autarky and reducing Chinese dependence on international financial systems controlled by Western nations. But their successors, beginning with Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the 1970s, pursued a more sophisticated strategy. Instead of isolating China from global commodity markets, they would dominate them. Instead of avoiding precious metals, they would accumulate them on an unprecedented scale. Instead of trusting international financial institutions controlled by America and Europe, they would build alternative systems that could eventually challenge Western monetary hegemony. The strategy required patience, discipline, and generational thinking that Western financial institutions, focused on quarterly profits, couldn't match. Chinese officials studied the Silver Purchase Act and its consequences obsessively, treating it as a case study in how monetary policy could be weaponized against nations dependent on specific commodities. They identified several key lessons that would guide Chinese policy for the next 80 years. First, never again would China base its monetary system on a single commodity that foreign powers could manipulate through market intervention. Second, China would accumulate strategic reserves of any commodity that could be used against them or that they could use against others. Third, China would build domestic production capabilities in every critical material to reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. Most importantly, China would position itself to turn the tables on any nation that attempted to use commodity manipulation as economic warfare. If America had used silver to destroy Chinese monetary stability, then China would eventually use silver, gold, and other strategic materials to challenge American monetary dominance. The plan required decades of implementation and careful coordination between government agencies, state-owned enterprises, and private companies operating under state guidance. Beginning in the 1980s, Chinese companies began acquiring mining operations worldwide, securing long-term supply contracts with major producers, and building processing facilities that could turn raw materials into refined products for both domestic consumption and strategic reserves. Chinese silver imports, virtually non-existent during the Mao era, began growing systematically after economic reforms. By the 1990s, China was importing over 1,000 tons of silver annually. By the 2000s, over 2,000 tons. By the 2010s, over 4,000 tons annually, representing roughly 40% of global mine production flowing into China and never flowing back out. This wasn't random commodity speculation. This was systematic accumulation, guided by officials who remembered what American silver policy had done to their nation. Chinese strategic planning documents from this period, declassified years later, explicitly referenced the Silver Purchase Act as justification for building massive precious metals reserves. The Shanghai Gold Exchange, established in 2002, created Chinese domestic markets for precious metals trading that reduced dependence on London and New York price discovery mechanisms. The Shanghai Silver Exchange followed in 2009, providing Chinese companies and government agencies with controlled access to silver markets that couldn't be manipulated by Western financial institutions. Chinese companies were encouraged, through subsidies, tax incentives, and direct government coordination to stockpile silver for industrial use, rather than purchasing supplies on spot markets where prices could be manipulated. Electronics manufacturers, solar panel producers, and other silver-intensive industries built strategic inventories measuring in millions of ounces, rather than the just-in-time supply chains favored by Western companies. By 2020, China controlled approximately 60% of global silver refining capacity through state-owned and state-influenced companies. They held an estimated 2 billion ounces of silver in various forms across government reserves, corporate stockpiles, and private holdings encouraged by government policy. But accumulation was only the first phase of the strategy. The second phase would be using those accumulated reserves to challenge the financial system that had once been used against China. The formation of BRICS, originally the acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represented the culmination of decades of Chinese strategic planning to create alternative financial infrastructure outside Western control. What began as loose economic cooperation evolved into a systematic challenge to dollar-based international trade and monetary systems. The timing wasn't coincidental. By 2020, China had accumulated sufficient precious metals reserves and built adequate processing capacity to support alternative monetary systems based on physical commodities rather than fiat currencies controlled by Western central banks. BRICS provided the multilateral framework needed to implement commodity-based trade mechanisms that could eventually bypass the dollar entirely. Chinese officials understood that challenging dollar dominance required more than accumulating gold and silver. They needed trading partners willing to accept precious metals as payment for goods and services. They needed financial institutions capable of clearing transactions outside the SWIFT banking system controlled by Western powers. Most importantly, they needed other major economies that shared their interest in reducing American monetary hegemony. Russia provided the perfect partner for this strategy. Sanctioned by Western nations after events in Ukraine, Russia was already highly motivated to develop financial systems outside Western control. As one of the world's largest gold producers, Russia could supply additional precious metals for any alternative monetary system. As a major energy exporter, Russia could provide the industrial commodities that China needed for continued economic growth. The other BRICS nations brought different advantages. Brazil controlled significant mining operations and agricultural exports that could support commodity-based trade. India had substantial gold reserves and growing industrial capacity. South Africa dominated global platinum production and had historical experience with gold-based monetary systems. Together, BRICS nations controlled over 50% of global precious metals production and held enormous stockpiles of gold, silver, platinum, and other strategic materials that could back alternative currencies or settlement systems. More importantly, they represented markets large enough to support international trade without dollar intermediation. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, dominated by China and Russia, provided additional institutional framework for commodity-based trade arrangements. Energy exports from Russia to China were increasingly settled in yuan rather than dollars. Chinese manufactured goods exports to Russia were paid for with gold transfers, rather than currency exchanges through Western banking systems. In 2022, China and Russia announced the development of a gold-backed digital currency for trade settlement between BRICS nations. The system would allow participating countries to trade goods and services using a digital token backed by physical gold reserves held in secure vaults managed by consortium members. The Moscow Precious Metals Exchange, launched in 2024 with Chinese technical and financial support, provided price discovery mechanisms for gold, silver, platinum, and palladium that operated independently of London and New York markets. For the first time since the 19th century, major economies had access to precious metals pricing that wasn't controlled by Western financial institutions. Chinese silver stockpiles became crucial to this alternative system's credibility. When BRICS nations needed to demonstrate that their commodity-backed currencies had real value, they could point to the billions of ounces of silver held in Chinese strategic reserves. When Western financial institutions attempted to manipulate precious metals prices through paper derivatives, Chinese physical reserves provided the foundation for alternative pricing mechanisms. The strategy required careful timing and gradual implementation to avoid triggering immediate Western retaliation. BRICS couldn't simply abandon dollar-based trade overnight without causing economic disruption that would hurt their own development. But they could systematically reduce dollar dependence while building alternative systems that would be ready when geopolitical conditions made such alternatives necessary. By 2025, BRICS trade settlements had grown to over $2 trillion annually, with increasing percentages conducted outside traditional dollar-based systems. Chinese silver reserves provided the foundation for much of this alternative trade, serving as collateral for credit arrangements and backing for digital currencies that allowed major economies to conduct international commerce without dollar intermediation. The Silver Purchase Act of 1934 had shown how precious metals could be weaponized against nations dependent on specific monetary systems. 90 years later, China was implementing the reverse strategy, using silver and other precious metals to build alternatives to the monetary system that had once been used to destroy Chinese economic stability. Right now in 2025, the same precious metals that America once used to devastate China's economy are being deployed by China and its allies to challenge American monetary dominance on a scale that dwarfs anything seen in modern financial history. The numbers tell a story of systematic preparation for economic warfare that most Western analysts have completely missed. Chinese silver imports have accelerated dramatically since 2020, rising from 4,000 tons annually to over 6,000 tons in 2024, and preliminary data suggests they're on track for 8,000 tons in 2025. That represents roughly 60% of global mine production flowing into China, while virtually no silver flows back out to international markets. But raw import numbers only tell part of the story. Chinese companies across multiple industries have been building strategic silver stockpiles that far exceed their immediate production needs. Contemporary AmpereX technology, China's largest battery manufacturer, holds over 50 million ounces of silver in strategic reserves, enough for approximately 3 years of production at current levels. BYD, China's dominant electric vehicle producer, maintains silver inventories exceeding 30 million ounces across multiple facilities. Chinese solar panel manufacturers present even more dramatic examples of strategic stockpiling. Jinko Solar, Trina Solar, and Longyi Green Energy collectively hold over 200 million ounces of silver in various forms, representing nearly 3 times their annual consumption requirements. These companies aren't building these stockpiles for efficiency or cost savings. They're building them because Chinese government policy encourages strategic material accumulation as preparation for potential supply disruptions from Western sanctions. The People's Bank of China has been purchasing gold for 18 consecutive months, adding over 400 tons to official reserves, while likely accumulating additional quantities through unofficial channels. But Chinese silver purchases dwarf their gold accumulation in terms of market impact. While China's gold purchases represent roughly 15% of global mine production, their silver purchases approach 60% of annual supply. Chinese strategy extends beyond simple accumulation to market control through vertical integration. Jiangxi Copper Company, China's largest metals producer, controls silver refining capacity approaching 40% of global output. Tongling Non-Ferrous Metals Group dominates silver processing for electronics applications. Together, Chinese companies control the supply chains that determine how much refined silver reaches global markets and at what prices. This vertical integration creates leverage that goes far beyond simple inventory accumulation. If Chinese companies slow their silver processing or redirect output to domestic consumption, global silver supply contracts immediately. If they accelerate processing and release stockpiled inventory, they can overwhelm Western markets and crash prices that support American mining operations. The Moscow Precious Metals Exchange, launched in 2024 with substantial Chinese technical and financial backing, has grown to handle over 15% of global gold trading and nearly 10% of silver transactions. More importantly, trades on the Moscow Exchange increasingly settle in yuan, rubles, or digital currencies backed by physical precious metals rather than dollars. Indian silver imports, coordinated with Chinese purchasing through BRICS mechanisms, have risen to over 8,000 tons annually, representing nearly 30% of global production. Combined Chinese and Indian demand now accounts for nearly 90% of global silver mine output, leaving minimal supplies for Western industrial users and investors. The timing of this accumulation isn't coincidental. Chinese leadership understands that American and European governments are implementing green energy mandates that will dramatically increase silver consumption over the next decade. Electric vehicle production requires approximately 1 ounce of silver per vehicle. Solar panel installation requires 20 grams per panel. 5G infrastructure demands silver for network equipment and data processing facilities. President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act allocated over $300 billion for renewable energy projects that collectively require more silver than exists in current global stockpiles. European Union climate policies mandate solar panel installations that would consume approximately 500 million ounces of silver over the next 5 years. These policies assume unlimited silver availability at current prices. China has positioned itself to control the physical silver supplies that Western green energy policies require for implementation. When American and European companies need silver for solar panel manufacturing, electric vehicle production, or telecommunications infrastructure, they will increasingly depend on Chinese-controlled supply chains that can be restricted or weaponized during geopolitical conflicts. Tesla discovered this vulnerability in late 2024 when attempts to secure long-term silver contracts for expanded production revealed that most major suppliers had existing commitments to Chinese companies. Ford and General Motors face similar constraints as they pursue electric vehicle mandates that require massive silver consumption for motor components and battery systems. American solar panel manufacturers are experiencing even more severe supply constraints. First Solar, the largest domestic producer, has been forced to reduce production targets because they cannot secure adequate silver supplies at prices that make their panels cost competitive with Chinese alternatives backed by government-subsidized materials. The pattern is identical to what happened to China in 1934, except the roles are reversed. Then, American policy inflated silver prices and drained Chinese reserves. Now, Chinese accumulation is inflating silver prices while draining Western stockpiles and making it increasingly difficult for American and European companies to access the materials they need for their own government-mandated industrial policies. The strategic implications of Chinese silver accumulation extend far beyond commodity speculation into the foundation of monetary systems, industrial competitiveness, and geopolitical power relationships that will determine the global economic order for the next 50 years. First, consider the mathematical constraints that make this situation unprecedented in modern financial history. Global silver mine production peaked in 2015 at approximately 900 million ounces annually and has declined to roughly 800 million ounces due to declining ore grades and exhausted deposits. Meanwhile, industrial silver demand has exploded from 500 million ounces in 2020 to over 1 billion ounces projected for 2025. This deficit of over 200 million ounces annually must be filled from above-ground stockpiles accumulated during previous decades of surplus production. But those stockpiles are finite and concentrated increasingly in Chinese hands. Western silver reserves, once substantial enough to buffer supply shortages, have been systematically drained by Chinese purchasing, while Western governments focused on managing debt levels rather than strategic material security. If current Chinese accumulation continues alongside growing industrial demand from green energy mandates, available Western silver stockpiles will be exhausted within 3 to 5 years. After that point, silver prices will be determined entirely by Chinese willingness to release strategic reserves, rather than by traditional supply and demand dynamics in mining markets. This creates unprecedented leverage for China in negotiations over trade policies, technology transfers, and geopolitical disputes with Western nations. When the United States needs silver for defense electronics, satellite systems, and military communications equipment, they will be dependent on Chinese-controlled supply chains that can be restricted during conflicts over Taiwan, trade disputes, or sanctions policies. When European companies need silver for renewable energy projects mandated by their own government's climate policies, they will compete with American buyers for supplies controlled by Chinese state-owned enterprises that prioritize political objectives over profit maximization. The nations that imposed green energy mandates without securing strategic material supplies will find themselves hostage to Chinese commodity diplomacy. The financial system implications are equally profound. Chinese silver accumulation, combined with gold purchases and digital currency development, provides the foundation for international trade systems that could eventually bypass the dollar entirely. BRICS nations already conduct over $2 trillion in annual trade, much of it settled in currencies backed by Chinese precious metals reserves. If silver prices continue rising due to supply constraints and Chinese market control, dollar-denominated financial assets become less attractive to international investors seeking protection against currency debasement. Central banks outside the Western alliance increasingly view precious metals as preferable reserves compared to dollar-denominated bonds that lose purchasing power through inflation and quantitative easing policies. The demonstration effect of Chinese silver strategy encourages other nations to pursue similar accumulation policies for strategic materials within their sphere of influence. Russia dominates global palladium and platinum production. Brazil controls significant lithium and rare earth deposits. These nations observe Chinese success in weaponizing commodity accumulation and implement similar strategies for materials critical to Western industrial processes. The result is systematic fragmentation of global commodity markets into competing blocks based on geopolitical alignment rather than economic efficiency. Nations aligned with China and Russia gain preferential access to materials controlled by that alliance. Nations aligned with the United States and Europe find themselves increasingly dependent on higher-cost domestic production or vulnerable supply chains controlled by hostile powers. For American industrial competitiveness, the implications are catastrophic. Green energy mandates that require massive silver consumption become impossible to implement at costs competitive with Chinese alternatives backed by subsidized materials. Electric vehicle production targets become unachievable when motor components require silver, controlled by Chinese suppliers who prioritize domestic consumption. Defense contractors face supply chain vulnerabilities that threaten national security capabilities. Advanced radar systems, hypersonic missiles, and satellite communications equipment all require silver for optimal performance. If Chinese suppliers restrict access during military conflicts, American technological advantages could be neutralized through material shortages rather than battlefield defeats. The housing market, manufacturing sector, and service economy all depend on stable access to materials needed for electronic devices, appliances, and infrastructure systems that contain silver components. Price volatility or supply restrictions for strategic materials create inflation pressures and supply chain disruptions that affect every sector of the American economy. Most fundamentally, the Chinese silver strategy demonstrates the vulnerability of fiat currency systems to commodity-based economic warfare. The dollar's value depends ultimately on international confidence in American economic and military power. If Chinese commodity accumulation can restrict American access to materials needed for industrial production and technological development, confidence in long-term American competitiveness declines accordingly. International investors and central banks observe Chinese success in accumulating strategic materials and question whether dollar-denominated assets provide adequate protection against economic warfare capabilities demonstrated by America's primary strategic competitor. This creates pressure for diversification away from dollar reserves toward physical commodities or currencies backed by nations that control critical materials. The 1934 Silver Purchase Act demonstrated how monetary policy in one nation could destabilize the economic and political systems of another nation through commodity market manipulation. 90 years later, China is implementing the reverse strategy with silver accumulation that could potentially destabilize dollar-based international monetary systems and American industrial competitiveness. Whether this represents deliberate economic warfare or simply rational response to Western sanctions and military threats, the outcome remains the same: systematic transfer of strategic material control from Western nations to Chinese-controlled supply chains that can be weaponized during future conflicts. The lesson of 1934 was clear. Control over monetary metals can be a matter of national survival. Whether intentional or accidental, American silver policy destroyed China's monetary system, collapsed their economy, and contributed to political chaos that lasted for generations. The echoes of that decision reverberated for decades, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Asia and creating conditions that allowed communist forces to seize control of the world's most populous nation. Today, we are witnessing the reverse scenario playing out with mathematical precision and strategic patience that dwarfs anything seen in modern economic history. China has transformed from victim to aggressor, from silver seller to silver accumulator, from monetary dependent to potential monetary hegemon. The numbers are undeniable. Chinese silver accumulation now represents 60% of global mine production. BRICS nations control 50% of precious metals output. Alternative trade settlement systems process $2 trillion annually outside dollar-based mechanisms. Silver prices have risen 150% in a single year as physical supplies become concentrated in Chinese strategic reserves. This isn't random commodity speculation. This is systematic implementation of lessons learned from American silver policy 90 years ago. The nation that was once victimized by commodity warfare is now the rising power, using identical tactics against the monetary system that once dominated global trade. The script has flipped completely. In 1934, silver flowed from east to west, draining Chinese reserves and destroying their currency stability. In 2025, silver flows from west to east, accumulating in Chinese stockpiles while Western nations face supply constraints that threaten their own industrial policies and monetary stability. The green energy transition that Western governments have mandated through legislation and subsidies requires massive silver consumption that assumes unlimited metal availability at stable prices. But those assumptions were made without considering that China had learned the strategic value of controlling scarce materials needed for technological development. When American companies need silver for solar panels, electric vehicles, and defense electronics, they will compete with Chinese state-owned enterprises that prioritize political objectives over profit margins. When European manufacturers need silver for renewable energy projects mandated by their own climate policies, they will depend on supply chains controlled by their primary strategic competitor. You cannot escape the system, but you can understand it. The same patterns that destroyed Chinese monetary stability in the 1930s are now being deployed against the dollar-based international system that enabled American economic dominance for 80 years. Physics always wins over financial engineering. You can create unlimited paper claims on silver through derivatives and futures contracts, but you cannot create actual silver through monetary policy. You cannot produce more metal than geology and mining economics allow. When one nation accumulates 60% of physical supply, while other nations depend on paper markets for price discovery, the outcome is mathematically predetermined. If this video opened your eyes to how the same commodity warfare tactics that America used to devastate China in 1934 are now being deployed in reverse against the dollar system, if you can now see how Chinese strategic patience has positioned them to control materials essential for Western industrial policies, then subscribe to Economic Rewind. Because this is just the beginning of a much larger story about the systematic transfer of strategic material control from Western nations to Chinese-dominated supply chains. Next week, I'll show you how the same pattern is playing out in lithium markets that control battery technology, rare earth elements that power every electronic device, and copper supplies that determine infrastructure development capacity. The patterns are all connected, and once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. This is Economic Rewind, where we uncover the financial patterns that shaped history and are shaping your future right now. Hit subscribe because understanding these patterns is your only protection against economic warfare you didn't know was happening. The post-World War II monetary order, built on dollar dominance and Western financial institutions, is being challenged for the first time in 80 years. The outcome of that challenge will determine whether America remains the dominant economic power or becomes dependent on strategic materials controlled by nations that remember exactly what happened when commodity markets were weaponized against them. In 1934, a piece of legislation in Washington changed the fate of a nation halfway around the world. Today, we may be living through the reverse scenario, where Chinese strategic patience and systematic accumulation changes the fate of the nation that once dominated global monetary systems. Silver at $75 might not be the end of this story. It might just be the beginning of the greatest monetary reversal in modern history.